This conference will now be recorded. This conference will
Thank you for
now be
joining.
recorded.
And we really wanted to discuss some procurement contracting and some issues with managing debris. We know this was a very large event. We know that it has affected multiple communities across the state. It's resulted in large amounts of debris, mainly vegetative debris, which is really going to be the focus of my presentation here today. I do understand that you do have some structures, some whether they're residential or private residential or business structures. I'm not going to talk a lot about that. And you will have some, because of private structures being damaged, you may find yourself trying to dispose of some other debris such as household hazardous debris or construction type debris, 2x4s, shingles, siding, etc., those types of things. But I think the main debris we're going to have in this event is vegetative. So again, I'll focus really on that. So for procurement and contracting, I want to let you know that, again, I'm going to touch on some federal regulation that covers procurements under federal grants. And I just want you to know that the presentation doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover all federal procurement contracting requirements. So you can find them, everything that's applicable to what we're talking about, and in complete details at 2 CFR Part 200, or it's often referred to as Uniform Rules. Yeah. And this is for all federal procurement and contracting requirements. So please take the time after this presentation to really dig in and understand it better. And again, if you have questions afterwards, you can certainly email them to me. And if you haven't already, when it comes to contracting, I would recommend that you possibly involve your city or county attorney just to make sure your contracts will meet these requirements. Yeah. So state governmental applicants, I don't know if we have any on the call with us, but just in case, so you're aware, state entities, whether that be Iowa DNR, such as parks, Iowa DOT, other state entities, you must follow the same policies and procedures you would normally with non-federal funds. And non-state applicants, this would be local governments such as cities, counties, municipalities, certain private nonprofits, and certainly federally recognized tribal entities. You must use your own written procurement procedures, which reflect applicable state, tribal, and local government laws and regulations. The key here is provided that the procurements conform to applicable federal law and standards. This applies to tribal governments as well. What I mean specifically, in conformance with applicable federal law and standards, many times a lot of the larger cities have a more, I would refer to it as kind of a more robust procurement standards, and they deal with grants, and likely you have measures in your procurement to address federal awards. Some of the smaller communities, PNPs and so forth, have really basic procurement actions, procurement requirements. And if your procurements do not meet at a minimum the federal requirements, you're going to need to make sure you're in compliance with the federal. So we'll touch on a few more things here. So tribal and local governments, PNPs, you must use one of the following procurement methods. This is all out of 2 CFR, the federal regulation. Micro purchases are those that are less than $10,000, these types of purchases may be awarded without soliciting competitive quotations if price is considered reasonable. And that's important throughout all of this, price reasonableness. The federal regulation, small purchase requirements, small purchases are considered anything less than $250,000. Often it's referred to as the simplified acquisition threshold. These are simple, more informal, they're more informal types of procurement actions where maybe you receive silver price quotes. FEMA likes to see a minimum of 3. Some other types of procurement methods, sealed bids, which likely through formal advertising, and then competitive proposals. Generally, these are more for securing the services of professionals such as engineers and consultants and so forth. These are generally more qualifications based, and with obviously price being considered not first, but certainly it is a consideration. And what I was speaking earlier about those who may not have federal requirements or have purchasing requirements that don't quite meet the federal requirements. There are those cities and communities who have a more robust procurement and purchasing policy. And so what you're going to want to ensure is that what I just gave to you here is what the federal regulation says. Now, if your specific local procurement is more restrictive than this, you're going to want to make sure you follow the more restrictive. So I'll just give you an example. The small purchase procedure, according to the federal regulation, it's any purchase less than $250,000. Informal price quotes are okay, but I would almost bet that a majority of the cities, communities, and county governments out there, you have a much, much lower threshold than 250,000 just to get quotes or informal prices for services or goods. So you're going to want to make sure you're following the most restrictive. I hope that makes sense. Let's talk about non-competitive procurement. I want to caution everybody to that, and I would imagine a majority of those listening are already in some form of a contract like this. These are also considered, sole source contracting, but this non-competitive procurement, it's limited primarily to emergency work. And this is according to federal regulation, one or more of the following must apply. The service or item is only available from a single source. I don't think we're quite dealing with that here. The public exigency or emergency for the requirement will not permit delay resulting from competitive solicitation. And I'm betting that particular one is fairly applicable in the situation with this storm event we're dealing with. FEMA recipient expressly authorizes in response and request, and after a solicitation of a number of sources, competition is determined inadequate. Talk a little bit more about the exigent or emergency circumstances. These types of procurement actions are allowable under certain circumstances for federal grants. We named a few of them on the previous slide, but one of the things I want you to be aware of that it really deals with an immediate action that requires you to address this public emergency, and you cannot delay through competitive solicitation. That's really the driving factor here. And so you're all aware, this really does represent an exception to federal requirements for full and open competition. And so since full and open competition really is a driving factor with federal grants, when you're in these sole source type procurement actions, be sure that you're documenting things appropriately and you're capturing the reasons and put together a justification for why you're taking this type of action. That is something that auditors will be looking for. So just a pointer for that. I want you to be aware FEMA approval is not required to avoid competitive solicitation. You don't have to get FEMA approval. However, this does not relieve you from complying with other procurement requirements. And again, that's why I measured, or I provided 2 CFR Part 200 to you. And there's a lot of procurement requirements within that. So just know that that doesn't, just because you're in an emergency situation, you're not relieved from complying with other parts of 2 CFR. And secondly, from ensuring costs are reasonable. That's really quite a pitfall, and I'll talk about a few pitfalls here in a moment. But we have a lot of times where different contracts are entered into and the costs end up being unreasonable. A lot of time and material contracts get entered into, the costs end up being very unreasonable at the end compared to the work that was accomplished. So that's really important, comparing the two, cost and the amount of work accomplished. And that can jeopardize your federal funding. These are acceptable contract types: lump sum, unit price, cost plus a fixed fee. And we already spoke about time and materials type contracts and those type of procurement actions. So if no other, just to reiterate, if no other contract is suitable, you're limited to time, and you don't have the ability to go out for competitive procurement because of the situation we're in, just be sure that your time and materials contracts are for a limited time only, and they must have a ceiling price so that the contractor is at their own risk once they exceed that ceiling. And it also requires you to provide a high degree of contractor oversight. Because let's face it, really, when a contractor's on a time and materials contract, there's really no incentive for efficiency or moving quickly or doing things specifically how you want them to, because they're there to make money, and when that clock's ticking, they're making money. So it will take a high degree of contractor oversight. The warning here, just be aware, and I really want you to take this warning to heart. FEMA does not reimburse costs incurred under a cost plus percentage contract. We see this quite often where contractors will just give they're under a time and materials type contract, and they'll say, here's what it's going to cost to do it. And by the way, we're going to tack on an extra percentage at the end. Those types of contracts are not allowable under federal awards. Something else to be aware of with your contracts, again, I'm not going to cover everything. Federal contract provisions are required within a body of your contract. There's an attachment to the contract, and those specific contract provisions are found at 2 CFR Part 200, and that's Appendix 2. And there is a website for the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. I use it often. I have it saved in my browser so that I get to it easily. Another really important thing you need to be sure in all types of contracting is you must not use suspended or debarred contractors. I don't know how many we'll run across in this event, but there have been contractors in the past. We do get contractors from out of state during these large events. If a contractor has been debarred or suspended and they're not allowed to participate in federal awards, you must not use that contractor. The website I provided there, that www.sam.gov, that is a really helpful resource where you can go to that website and you can do a search of that contractor by typing in their name, and it will search if the federal records will search to see if a specific contractor has been debarred, and it'll come up if that specific one has been, either that or it'll just simply tell you that there's no record of it. So please use that tool to help you through this. It's important. I mentioned earlier there's some common pitfalls to time and material contracts. And these are some big ones we find often, and FEMA ends up at times completely not funding the contract or the cost of the contract, or maybe partial. So open-ended contracts, with no ceiling. Again, there's no incentive for that contractor to be efficient. So if you've entered into time and material contracts already, I would highly suggest that you get with that contractor and possibly renegotiate and find a way to put a ceiling on that. And you're going to be way better off when FEMA is ready to write up your expenses. Not ensuring costs are reasonable. That's another thing. I mentioned that earlier. Make sure you drive the ship on this. I know sometimes contractors are in high demand and it's tough to get them, but don't let them run over you. Make sure that you're negotiating reasonable rates, reasonable profit, and you're going to be way better off when it comes to that. And we do understand, and FEMA does understand, they do consider the circumstances that contractors are getting premium rates for times like this, but just be aware, costs still need to be reasonable, and you get yourself in some trouble in getting those costs funded by FEMA. Another common pitfall, failing to include termination for cause and for convenience in your contracts. These would be for contracts in excess of $10,000. I believe this clause is in the Appendix 2 federal contract provisions. I believe either that or it is in Part 200. I apologize, but it is in the Code of Federal Regulation. We do at times see where folks don't put that in there, and they have no way of getting out of this contract with a contractor. Not checking debarment, suspension, or irresponsible contractors, and also lack of contractor oversight. So like I mentioned earlier, you drive the ship on this, you provide really good oversight, because even if we get federal assistance for this, you're still going to have a cost share in this. So please negotiate your rates. So that's really, I don't want to get into any greater detail with procurement and contracting. Those are the basics. I do want to talk about some basic debris management and some FEMA guidance. I'm going to provide a lot of what I'm providing you, or all of what I'm providing you, I should say, has come from FEMA's debris field guides, or their program and policy guide for these types of debris events. So I'm gonna kind of break this part of the presentation into these 5 different groups here, and kind of go through each one of them individually. So first of all, debris removal phases, and this is important. as you think about how you're currently under contract and how you're currently moving forward with your contracts and your debris clearance activities. So really, two parts. The initial debris clearance activities are to eliminate threats to public health and safety, these imminent threats. You know, you have streets blocked, you have sidewalks blocked, so on and so forth. I mean, you truly have an emergency on your hands. These are the times where you really don't have a choice but to enter into time and materials contracts. You don't have time to wait. And the other phase really is your debris removal activities, if you think of it more as a means to recovery. So you're past that initial imminent threat, and now you're more into a recovery phase. So kind of think about them in those two aspects. Jumped ahead of myself on the previous slide a little bit. The initial debris clearance activities, you know, that initial imminent threat to public health and safety, again, clearing of roadways and sidewalks, clearing other heavily accessed public areas, removing dangerous toppled or leaning trees, dangerous hanging limbs. We refer to them as hangers or FEMA would. And these are directly above heavily accessed public areas. So there's just, there's no way you want to leave these things because the public is continually accessing these areas. There's a danger for falling limbs. There's a danger for a tree falling on someone, a car, or something, and you just really need to get that taken care of. So these are really imminent types of imminent safety threats. As you kind of get out of that phase and you move more into a debris removal activity as a means to recovery. Think about the full recovery of your debris issue here. Some examples are, you know, collecting of scattered debris from public areas. People frequent less. These could, you know, this is public property, but, you know, they're in areas where, you know, people really don't go there. It's a maintained area, but it's not the street right out in front of City Hall, or it's you know, it's not a tree that's leaning clear out over Main Street that could fall on cars at any time. It's really just collecting that scattered debris, less frequented. And then removal of dangerous hanging limbs or hangers from public areas, again, that people frequent less. Transferring debris from staging sites to the debris's final resting place, such as landfill, whether you're burning, grinding sites. When it comes time for reducing your debris through burning, grinding, chipping, hauling away ash, your grindings or your chips. So these are really types of activities, or if you think about it, yes, it's important. It's an eyesore. It's necessary, but it's really gotten us out of that stage where not generally it isn't creating an imminent threat to public health and safety. Now there are some exceptions, but I just wanted to present this time or present these two phases just to kind of get you thinking about this. And I just put a note there. Generally, when you're in this phase here, it's time to competitively procure because you're out of that emergency situation. Let's talk about debris eligibility for a moment. Types of eligible debris must be debris generated as a result of the event, and so we have received a disaster declaration. So debris that was generated as a direct result of that event can be eligible. The debris must be located within a designated disaster area. And I'm going to add just a little bit of an explanation on that. We have some communities, this may sound real strange. I know for a fact we have some cities that fall in more than one county. And it's possible that one county can receive a presidential disaster declaration and one county might not. Only the debris that's in that disaster designated county or area is eligible. So I know it seems very strange. It's all the same community, but FEMA really breaks it up by county. So that's something to keep in mind for the communities that fall that cover more than one county. That's an example. The debris removal must be the legal responsibility of you as the local jurisdiction. And again, the debris must pose an immediate threat to public health and safety. It may not be that imminent threat, but generally all debris poses some form of public health and safety threat. Types of debris not eligible, and these are just examples. Debris on private property. Now, what I mean by that, debris on private property, it's not allowed for your employees or your contractors to walk onto private property and remove debris. That's not eligible under the PA program. Of course, when homeowners themselves bring the debris to the right-of-way, near the curb, wherever the city or county or that community has designated as the place to put it in their right-of-way, that is eligible. And the reason because is now it's on city property. Now you've given them the go-ahead to do so. Now it becomes your legal responsibility as a community. Other types of not eligible gated communities. If you can imagine, these types of gated communities aren't open to the public. It's for a specific population. It's not for the general population. So generally, gated communities are not eligible for debris removal. Same as commercial properties. Commercial properties generally, FEMA would expect commercial homeowners as well, but insurance to try to cover any debris issues on commercial properties. I put a note in there that there are certain circumstances that may allow for the debris removal to be eligible. There are certain circumstances. However, it must receive prior FEMA approval before you do so. So we recommend that you contact our office if for any of those circumstances, if you're curious to know what types of circumstances FEMA might allow. Other types of not eligible, debris in natural wooded areas. Just you got a nice forested area. There's no trails through it. It's just kind of a natural area. I realize that fallen trees, broken limbs, and everything might be unsightly, but that's not under FEMA's program. That type of debris is not eligible to be removed. Also, other unmaintained public property, and also debris that existed prior to the event. Sometimes, a lot of times, it's difficult to tell the difference. But one example is like debris piles within cities. Most times cities have a reoccurring debris pile that communities bring their debris to that's allowable. You'll see a completely pile of debris that's just brown and dead. And you can tell it's been sitting there, and the disaster generated debris is bright green. The leaves are still green. So a lot of times you can tell. So just be aware that debris that existed prior is not eligible. So as far as vegetative eligibility, the types of vegetative debris that is eligible, scattered limbs and branches that are in the public right-of-way and pose a public health and safety threat. You're going to have scattered limbs and branches through your parks, on trails, could be county trails, city trails. There's a lot of bike trails in our communities and counties. We love them and we want to keep them safe. So removing that debris, or if you have hangers, limbs hanging out over those trails, that creates a public health and safety threat. Generally, when we get into contracting, generally these are done on a unit price, volume in cubic yards, or weight in tons. That's if we're out of that imminent threat. Some additional vegetative eligibility. I mentioned the hazardous hanging limbs or hangers, and FEMA has in their policy requirements for eligibility. It must pose an immediate threat to the public, for health and safety. And if you can tell there's a common thread to all this, is that whatever the debris is has to be an immediate threat to the public health and safety. So these hazardous hanging limbs, hanging over public use areas, as I mentioned, parks, trails, sidewalks, playgrounds could be examples. There's also hanging limbs from trees located, the actual tree is located on private property. I know I just said not private property, but this is an exception. These hanging limbs can be eligible only when that tree is protruding out and above public right-of-way, and that has to be removed without entering private property. We have a lot of, especially in these neighborhoods where they've been established for many, many years, we have large trees that have grown up large right along a sidewalk. It's still on private property, but those limbs protrude out over the street, over the sidewalk. Those can be eligible to remove, but again, the actual tree itself on private property is not eligible to remove. Additionally, FEMA's policy states that in order for one of these hangers to be a threat, they must be 2 inches or greater in diameter. So little tiny twigs or small branches that are hanging, if they were to fall, I doubt they're going to cause serious injury to anybody. And what FEMA's not expecting is somebody to take a ladder and climb up the tree, and get your tape measure out and measure a 2-inch branch. That would be silly, but certainly keep in mind, I think we can all imagine what a 2-inch diameter tree limb might look like. Burned out, take it down. Additionally, whole tree removal can be eligible under the FEMA program as well. FEMA's policy says these trees must be 6 inches or greater in diameter. So little saplings, I suppose, in their policy, they may, the reason might be a little sapling falls, it's not going to do quite as much damage as opposed to a well-established tree 6 inches or greater. So that is one of the factors to consider. Also, for whole tree removal to be eligible, not only the diameter, if the tree has a split trunk, it can be eligible for full removal. If it has a broken canopy, generally if 50% or more, I think the rule of thumb is 50% or greater of that canopy, if it's broken or has come out of that tree, that whole tree is generally eligible for full removal. Most times that tree would not survive after that. Any trees leaning at an angle greater than 30 degrees. So again, this is kind of it's your call. A tree that's just barely leaning may not quite cause as much threat as a tree that's leaning 30 degrees angle or greater, because that has more of a potential to topple. And be aware that if you or a contractor remove that whole tree, FEMA only pays to flush cut that tree at ground level. FEMA generally doesn't pay to have those stumps removed. There's some exceptions, and I'll get to that in, I believe it's the next slide. And just take note that the charges should be on a per tree basis, or at least if you're getting estimates or somehow, I'm going to talk about documenting trees, but FEMA likes to see the per tree basis. And I know this is going to seem crazy for a lot of you, but this is a must, and it's going to take some time, so you have to designate somebody to do this. But GPS coordinates for each tree that you remove that you want FEMA to fund is required by FEMA. So I can just about see all of your faces and heads shaking right now, but we really have an issue with this when we come to when FEMA comes and we go to start documenting tree removal. If that's absent, we're going to have to try to recreate this. Here's your stump removal that I spoke of. As I mentioned earlier, FEMA pays to have a tree flush cut, and they consider that the end of the public health and safety threat. Again, that's the key thread here, public health and safety threat. That tree's gone. It's just a stump there. However, stump removal is eligible when and it's only when 50% or more of the root ball is exposed. We've had a lot of trees toppled, and it pulled the roots right up out of the ground. Or the tree might be leaning and that root ball is exposed 50% or more. You're going to likely you're going to cut that tree off at the root ball, at the stump there. FEMA will pay to have that root ball removed and dirt filled in there. Please take photos of all of this. FEMA likes to have proof. Please do everything you can to try and support your costs through photos. It's really important. And also, grinding of a stump may be eligible if it's less costly than extraction and it meets the criteria above. So really, FEMA's not in the business of grinding out stumps because generally it's not a public health and safety threat. There may be some other exceptions, but if you're getting bids to cut down, to flush cut trees, make sure they're separating the costs out for grinding out those tree stumps so that we can easily remove them from the FEMA costs, because a lot of times we have difficulty doing that. And as I mentioned, I put that note in there. Flush cutting generally eliminates the public health and safety threat. Again, GPS locations are required by FEMA. Types of vegetative activities, vegetative debris activities not eligible. The public assistance program, FEMA's federal funding, isn't meant for beautification. So it's not for pruning or trimming for aesthetic reasons. I know a lot of times contractors are up removing these dangerous hanging limbs, and a lot of times the city, that county might say, you know what, while you're up there, can you just kind of clean that side of that tree up a little bit that's been bothering me? Make sure you're separating that type of activity because it's not eligible. Obviously, I've talked about it enough, stump extraction or grinding. That doesn't meet the previous criteria that I mentioned. And also tree removal activities, not meeting the previously mentioned criteria for aesthetic reasons. You may have a dead tree that was previously, or maybe the tree didn't topple, that dead tree is still standing. That tree would not be eligible for removal because it was dead prior and was damaged prior to the event. Let's talk about, so that's kind of types of debris, the vegetative, some specific requirements as it applies to the removal of vegetative debris. Let's talk a little bit about documentation now. As you're aware, with any federal grant, documentation, documentation, documentation. And I'll guarantee you that FEMA is no exception. And the PA program is no exception. So FEMA does require debris collection and disposal to be quantified and documented by number of, I guess I don't know if that's proper verbiage to use there, but the documented by quantity, as I mentioned, trees or stumps, the number of, they want debris estimated by documented by cubic yards or tons. Some way we have to quantify the debris that's out there, and I'll try to help you out later on in this. A lot of the documentation that can be used, truck logs. We may not know, you may have already picked up your debris. You're like, we didn't measure any debris, but maybe I know exactly how many truckloads we hauled and burned. So if you know the number of your loads of your truck, that dump truck or whatever it may be, you can use the truck capacity to back into a cubic yard amount. So that's a little trick there. Landfill scale tickets for tonnage is another one. You may say, well, I don't know how to quantify it because everything we picked up I took to the landfill. But if you have landfill scale tickets, you have tonnage, we can quantify that. That's a good tool right there. Measuring your stockpiles that still exist by cubic yards. And just a little tip here, try to visualize your piles as a rectangle as opposed to like a pyramid or a pile, like a mountain type shape. Just kind of visualize it as a rectangle and measure it and convert it into cubic yards. I know there's a way to measure ash piles. I know a lot of you might say, well, if we had a huge debris pile here of limbs and branches, but we burn it all, it's nothing but an ash pile. Now, how do I know? How can I determine how much I had? There is a way to convert. I'm going to have to find it. I don't currently have it, so I apologize. But I have heard of a way to convert kind of ashes backwards into a debris pile. It's been done before. So if you're in that situation, reach out and I can try to get FEMA to help me out. Any trees removed, you're going to want to document how many, diameter, GPS location. I'll give you some pointers at the end here, a little bit more about that. Make sure you're documenting each of the trees with your dangerous hangers that need to be removed or have been removed, and a GPS location is required there. Just count the number of trees with hangers in them. Don't worry about looking at a tree and going around and counting each hanger over 2 inches there. Just document the tree that has a hanger. And certainly estimating can be used through extrapolating, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So I know this debris gets overwhelming when it's scattered citywide, countywide, community-wide. Some other specific documentation for tree and stump removal. And I'm going to keep trying to drive these points home. They may be repeated here. Actual counts are required, so the number of trees or stumps you've removed. Here's a good method that I've seen other communities do. It will require somebody to physically go out and start cataloging or documenting these trees that need removed. And I've seen communities go out and physically paint with spray paint, paint a number on that tree, number 1, number 2, number 3, so on and so forth. And and after you have identified a tree with a number and a location and a GPS, put it into a spreadsheet. So that way, when we are ready to start capturing this type of debris, you've got it in a spreadsheet and it's easily defensible, and you have photos. And I failed to put photos on here. That's one of the most important things are photos. And so you may be looking at this and say, well, I've already removed everything. I don't know where everything's at. Somehow you're gonna have to go back and try to regenerate this, because FEMA will require this information: the number, the GPS location, or address, and or GPS location is key, and then the diameter of the tree obviously as well. So please, in photos, please do this. So, and FEMA's also, I kind of broke this out a little bit differently here. FEMA requires documentation to support the method of debris removal. We talked about how to document eligible debris. Now we're going to talk about types of documentation to support the method of debris removal. Contractual, I know there's a lot of contractors out there. So what will be important is you are you are getting into actual contracts, executed contracts with those contractors. You're saving them. You're documenting your method of procurement. For those sole source procurements, that's going to be even more critical because you're going to need to support the reason for the sole source procurement. Truck logs for unit price contracts. I don't know if there's anybody that has a contract that's hauling by unit price. Keeping a log of those trucks is important. Number of the trucks, you know, most companies and most communities have trucks identified by number. Landfill tickets. And the reason for this, for contractors, if we have landfill tickets, we must demonstrate final proper disposal, and generally that's how we do that. The contractor just telling us, well, we properly disposed of it, FEMA's going to ask for some demonstration. Invoices, make sure you're keeping all your invoices to support your costs, and also, again, photos. Please have your contractor taking photos as well, and make sure you tell them you're going to expect that from them. You may choose to use your own labor forces and equipment. FEMA refers to this as force account labor and force account equipment. And so to document and to support this method of debris removal, FEMA, if you use your own work forces and equipment, be sure that you're documenting and creating a summary of labor hours for everyone who's worked. Document both regular and overtime. Break it down per employee and by date. So a summary of that will be critical, because if you're going to claim the costs for your labor and equipment, we will need to be able to document specific individuals and dates worked. Same goes for your equipment. Make sure you're keeping all of your equipment hours logged for all the time used. Equipment isn't work on regular overtime. The operators do. Equipment's always operating. Make sure you document per unit and the date, and be sure you're identifying the operator's name. To support those labor hours, you're going to need employee timesheets. We're going to need employee pay rates eventually. And if for determining hourly rates for equipment, if you have rates that you normally use, we can look at using those, or FEMA has published equipment rates. Demonstration of proper disposal will be critical. Without that, your federal funding won't be obligated, it won't be awarded, so proper disposal is key. And again, when your folks are out there, your employees, make sure they're taking photos to accurately demonstrate to help support your debris removal activities. Let's talk a little bit about proper disposal, and this will be critical. I will say that if there's one thing that will cause your debris removal activities to not be eligible is if this debris was not properly disposed of. And that would be in violation of a lot of federal requirements. So please refer. I think I sent out to all the county coordinators an Iowa DNR debris disaster debris disposal option packet. So please refer to that. This comes right from DNR. Also, it's not needed at this point, but as you are, let me say this, you need to be making the Iowa DNR aware of your disposal method in order for FEMA to, for it to be allowable through FEMA. The form that was in your packet, and I put a copy of it on the screen here, this form FEMA will ask for. This form is intended to show FEMA and to get concurrence from the Iowa DNR that yes, we concur, we're approving your debris disposal method. So this document here is really between you and the Iowa DNR. And so somehow through email, through mailing, somehow you're going to need to get approval from the Iowa DNR in order for your FEMA funding to be eligible, because again, FEMA will be asking for that. And within that packet, there are, if you're not sure who to contact with the DNR, there are specific field, Iowa DNR field locations, I believe, some contact information. You can reach out to someone at those numbers and to find out where these may need to go. Proper disposal continued here. Let's talk about this a little bit more. Vegetative, as you'll see on FEMA's, or excuse me, the Iowa DNR's debris disposal methods, burning is allowable under certain conditions, and the ashes that are a result of that burning, they do require proper disposal. And the Iowa DNR, as you'll see in that packet, views ash as a excuse me, as solid waste, and they will require that that ash be collected and disposed of properly, like in the trash or the landfill or something. I highly recommend you don't dig a hole and bury it, cover it back up. Of course, taking your debris to the landfill, approved landfills, I should have put there, they must be approved, permitted landfills. Chipping and mulching in sites that your community has approved. I know FEMA allows that. That's kind of a final ending point. If you have these wood chips or the mulch that you want to be used by the community for free, they can come and take it, put it around their house, gardens, whatever it might be. That is allowable at times. And again, that's a method identified on that form. I haven't talked a lot about any other types of debris, so I just want to touch on it and really briefly. Because of the type of event, as I mentioned, we have mostly vegetative, but I'm confident we have structures that have been destroyed or heavily damaged, and we have individuals that homeowners and so forth that might have brought out household hazardous waste to the curb. Make sure you're keeping that separate. Could be paint, other types of household chemicals and whatnot. Make sure you're keeping that separate from the vegetative debris. And let your contractors know that they are not, if that's sitting there, they are not to pick up that hazardous waste along with the vegetative debris and take it to the landfill. It needs to be addressed separately and taken to a legal authorized drop-off point established by your local government. Could have construction type debris, white goods, e-waste. Again, that type of debris, especially white goods and e-waste, keep that separate from any construction type debris that goes directly to the landfill to be buried. Also from the vegetative debris, and ensure this type of debris is taken to a landfill or other required drop-off point identified by your local jurisdiction, and also through recycling. Make sure you're documenting all of these disposal methods as well. I want to talk a little bit on field estimating tips, and I'm sorry I'm flipping back and forth there. I've messed up my slides. I apologize for the layout of this. So just a few tips For estimating debris, I know a lot of you have been hanging on for this, and I'm not going to get into a lot of great detail. I just want to give you just some simple solutions. I know that maybe sounds simple to me, and it's your issue, but we use this, our staff uses this when we head out into the field to identify debris and try to quantify large amounts of debris that's scattered. And we provide that to FEMA, and it's generally acceptable. So for the purpose of damage assessment in quantifying your debris, I kind of refer to this as boots on the ground type estimating. So I would recommend that you start off by identifying, I mean, we're far enough into this now, start off by identifying your impacted areas, say on a street map or something. Take your county map, take your city map with all your streets listed or something. Just be very simple. I suppose there's a way you can use your iPhone or something. So identify these impacted areas on a street map or something. This is my example. So take that map and then start divide this map into impacted areas, these impacted areas into smaller sections, like quadrants or something. Maybe a quadrant of four may, say four may not be small enough. It's too large of an area for a big city. Use Main Street, use intersecting highways or something, some way of breaking out your community into smaller bite-sized pieces, pieces. And then after you've done that, you've kind of divided this area up into these smaller sections. Identify a 20% representation. Some of these sections, identify what 20% might be of the overall impacted area, if that makes sense. Pick out 20% of these little squares you might have of these sections of town, whatever that might be, and make sure it's a representation of all sections. You're going to have some sections of town that just got pounded and that's so heavy. You're going to have other sections of town that may be lighter. So in that 20%, kind of get a general, an overall representation of both. Use some of your 20% sampling, use some areas that are heavily, use some that are less heavily impacted. And then after you've identified these areas physically, this is going to take a little bit of work, but physically go out to these sections and with groups or however you need to do it and actually measure these debris piles. You're going to have debris on curbs. You're going to have most of the debris I've seen out there has been brought to the right-of-way, to the curb areas from homeowners. I know you're going to still have some scattered debris in parks, but figure out some way where you can go out and get a pretty good idea, cubic yards wise, what type of, or the amount of debris you have in these areas. And once you have a pretty good handle on that, come on back and use that measurement of debris and just kind of extrapolate out. It would be reasonable to assume, if you've got a good representation of that 20%, it would be reasonable to assume that the remainder of these sections that you have identified as being impacted, be reasonable to assume they're very similar because you kind of have an average. Go ahead and take that amount of debris you've measured in that 20%, kind of extrapolate out, multiply it out by the number of remaining sections. This really gives you a pretty good indication of what you have out there without having to spend hours upon hours upon hours going to every square inch of your community trying to determine what you have. So just some very basic boots on the ground way to estimate. And of course, as you're out and as you're documenting this, take photos, please. Take photos. It's especially important for these areas that you've visited that are represented in all to show a good representation, so we can have that to provide to FEMA to explain to them your rationale behind this. Other ways are through aerial photography. For example, use of drones. We've seen a lot of activity from that. You can use drone footage. Again, if you have that video or you have some still shots, you could use the same methodology as I just explained above. This really can give you a good indication on the type of debris that you have out there. And this will be especially important for damage assessments. We do have counties that have been declared in this disaster declaration, but we will be reaching out to other counties to try to add on counties that were not initially identified in this disaster declaration. So this type of damage assessment methodology might be very beneficial to you, and it could be quite speedy too. These are just, again, some field estimating tips. It's a little different. Scattered debris is a little different, and you want to be a little more careful, a little more precise, especially for unit price type contracts. For unit price contracts, the estimating methodology, as I mentioned on that previous slide, could be acceptable to establish a starting point, because let's face it, if you're going to enter into a contract, you gotta have an idea what you have out there. However, unit price contracts are going to require heavy monitoring, so that you are tracking the debris at making sure they're taking eligible debris from the collection sites, wherever it may be, curbside, scattered, whatever it might be, and also monitoring at disposal sites, so that you know truck number one picked up here and truck number one showed up at the landfill to dispose, or at the staging site, and truck number one didn't disappear down a country road and dispose of his load in the creek or the river or some remote area. I'm sorry to dog on contractors. Most of them are great contractors, but there are some exceptions, and you know it always takes a few to ruin it for everybody else. So these are the types of things FEMA will be looking for if you're strictly going by unit price contract. So I've included this on the estimating tips just so you know that this may be an acceptable way to start a unit price contract. For lump sum contracts, it's going to be a little more difficult. You're going to have better defined scopes, because that scope of work in that contract is going to need to be, as I mentioned, more defined, more quantified, because you and the contractor need to know what's required of them. I'm picking up this park. I'm picking up everything I can see between Main Street and 2nd Avenue, between this street and this street. Break it up into quadrants or something. I mentioned that for larger areas or counties, consider breaking these up into maybe even into separate contracts, so that you've got a better handle and everybody knows what's expected of them. So lump sum contracts can be a little more difficult with debris like this, but it can be done. Just a few field estimating tips again that I have found to be very helpful for me. Conversion, here's some conversion factors. I know this is simple math, but I do from time to time have people ask me, how do you get cubic yards? Well, very simple, just multiply in feet, establish what cubic feet is. The length of the pile, the width of the pile, and the height of the pile multiplied out will give you cubic feet. To get cubic yards, you just simply divide it by 27. That's your cubic yardage. Very simple. Something to pay attention to, especially with vegetative debris. It's not highly compactable, so you might want to pay attention to piles that have a lot of airspace. But for piles, like I've seen a lot of piles out there already where end loaders have been up smashing it down, or it's very compacted. So that's, that'd be a little different in estimating that from just a couple of branches or something that just have tons of airspace in there. And vegetative debris, maybe you only have tonnage or something, and FEMA may say, well, can you tell me how many cubic yards you had? Well, no, but I have have scale tickets with tonnage. Generally, for vegetative debris, about 4 to 6 cubic yards. For vegetative debris equals 1 ton. Just a little trick there. For construction type debris, 2x4s, sheet metal, just insulation, any type of that debris. 2 cubic yards equals approximately 1 ton. These are all approximates. For mixed debris, which essentially is vegetative and everything mixed together, of course, not hazardous or white goods, 4 cubic yards equals a ton. When you're out measuring debris on curbside for your estimates, if you can imagine a pickup truck load, what that might look like. Usually a pickup truck will hold 1 to 2 cubic yards, obviously depending on the pickup. And then using your dump trucks, I think I might have mentioned this earlier, but using your dump trucks, just measure the box capacity. Each box has a dimension, and you can break that down into cubic yards as well. So these are just some simple things that can help you estimate some things out in the field. Just a couple, something else I wanted to bring to your attention, and I am not an expert at this. I just wanted to make you aware of some situations you might be dealing with. I know there's a lot of communities that are. You may have some structures out there, homes or businesses, whatever that might be. You may have these types of structures that are in fear of full or partial collapse. They are creating an immediate or imminent threat to public health and safety. Make sure you're following your local codes and ordinances to address such structures. Make sure the structure is secure from public entry, so that you secure that site to ensure that public entry won't happen. And then the placarding of structures notifying the public that entry is not permissible, because it is a public health and safety threat. So just some things to be thinking about. Ensure you're focusing and you're using your local codes and ordinances to do such. And as I mentioned, I'm not an expert at this. I just wanted to bring this to your attention, because in this declared disaster, we're going to be having I'm pretty sure we're going to be having some situations where we're going to have homes in this situation. Matter of fact, I know we have. And we have specific individuals. We're at the end of my presentation. Thank you all for sitting through this. I hope it was helpful. These are contacts that you can reach out to with questions or concerns. Katie Waters, who is my immediate boss. Katie is the Public Assistance Officer. There's Katie's email address. Again, I'm Rick Biondi. I am Katie's deputy, and there is my email address. So anything related to debris removal, please reach out to us. And then Jonathan, he goes by Dusty Pagonis. Dusty is the Deputy State Hazard Mitigation Officer. I mentioned the structures that are in fear of partial or complete collapse. Please contact Dusty with any questions you might have for these residential homes or businesses. Dusty can help you through this, because a lot of this might move out into eligibility for the Public Assistance Grant Program. So as I mentioned earlier, please, if you have questions, and I know you do, I can't possibly touch on everything, specifics, please email your questions to Katie or myself, or to Jonathan with residential structure questions. Thank you for joining us. I do appreciate it. I do wish you all well in your recovery efforts. And have a great day, and I'm sure we're going to be talking with many of you later on. Thank you.
This conference will now be recorded.